Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her when she walked past his office, not bothering to look up from his desk. Just a nurse with shaking hands and a community college degree. He had no idea those hands had held arterial bleeders closed with nothing but gauze and a prayer in a field hospital under fire. He had no idea about the pair of worn combat boots wrapped in plastic at the bottom of her locker at Sacred Heart in San Diego, the one she'd told absolutely no one about. He had no idea that Brooke Sullivan wasn't her real life, it was her escape from one. What happened next didn't just change the hospital. It ended careers. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer at 6:17 a.m. as Brooke Sullivan pushed through the ICU doors, the smell of antiseptic sharp and cold in the air like a surgical blade. Her scrubs were navy blue, chosen specifically because they didn't show blood. The tremor in her hands wasn't weakness, it was restraint. 2 years of learning to live in this smaller version of herself, checking vitals on unconscious patients, invisible to the doctors who moved past her like she was furniture. The night shift nurse, Rodriguez, handed off at the desk with a tired wave. Brooke nodded, already moving, already reading the monitors like they were a language she'd spoken since childhood. Room for 12, post-op thyroidectomy, vital stable. Room for 15, sepsis case from admitting yesterday, heart rate climbing. Room for 18, gunshot wound, surgical repair, pain management every 4 hours. She knew every number. She knew every patient like she'd put them back together herself. During morning rounds, Brooke stood at the edge of the group around bed 414, holding the chart, her eyes down. Dr. Marcus Sterling swept into the unit like he owned it, expensive watch, expensive cologne, the kind of arrogance that made the air pressure change around him. He was talking about his golf handicap. Always talking. Never listening. The attending physician was reviewing labs, and Sterling was making a point about some investment property in La Jolla. Nobody was paying attention to Brooke's hands as she checked the 4 line on Mrs. Chen, a post-operative cardiac patient. The line had started to infiltrate, the vein collapsing. She would need a new one placed, higher up the arm. Brooke's fingers moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgical instrument, finding the vein on the first try, guiding the 18-gauge needle through the skin with absolutely no tremor. The line slid home. Sinus rhythm. Perfect. She taped it down, covered it with gauze, labeled it with the time, 6:02 a.m. Nurse Jensen, who'd been watching while pretending not to, paused beside her at the med cart. "You tie surgical knots," Jensen said. It wasn't a question. There was respect in his voice, and something like recognition. Brooke didn't look up from the medication she was drawing up. "YouTube," she said quietly. "I watch a lot of videos." Jensen laughed, a short, honest sound, and walked back to his rounds. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just kept working, because that's what invisible people do. The break room at 7:41 a.m. was small and humming with the soft chaos of a rotating nursing staff. 3 nurses were sitting at the table, their voices low, their laughter the kind that carried edges. Brooke moved to her locker in the corner, pulled it open just enough to slip her work bag inside. The combat boots were wrapped in clear plastic at the very bottom, boots that had walked through Kandahar province and Sanjan Valley and a dozen places she never talked about. The leather was worn soft, the soles creased from thousands of kilometers. The boots had been there for 14 months, untouched, a secret she kept even from herself. She closed the locker quietly and left without pouring coffee, without sitting down. The tremor was back in her hands now. She pressed them against the cold stainless steel counter and breathed until it stopped. At 9:14 a.m., the radio crackled at the admit desk, "Incoming trauma, helicopter was landing on the pad in 4 minutes. Air Force Colonel, male, 63, unconscious, compound fracture left leg, possible internal bleeding, transport time 11 minutes. The unit moved like it had been trained to move, the dance they did without thinking. Beds were prepared. Blood was called from the bank. Dr. Sterling heard the radio and abandoned his coffee. He was already moving toward the trauma bay, his earlier arrogance sharpening into something focused and real. He was a good doctor. That was what made him dangerous. He had the skills to back up the attitude. 2 residents followed him, notebooks ready. An attending surgeon was paged overhead. Code response established. The helicopter appeared in the western sky at 9:18 a.m., the rotor wash shaking the windows of the 3rd floor, that sound like distant thunder rolling across the city. Brooke stood at the window, watching the landing pad below, watching the medics move in and out of the aircraft with the precise efficiency of people who lived in emergencies. The colonel came off the stretcher pale and unconscious, his right leg wrapped in a tourniquet, blood already seeping through the bandages. His daughter, mid-20s, wearing an Air Force Academy ring, followed the stretcher, her face a mask of controlled terror. Mothers, Brooke had learned, screamed. Daughters held it together until they were alone. Sterling took the case personally. Brooke watched from the hallway as he examined the colonel with the careful attention of a surgeon who knew exactly how much was at stake. The daughter stayed in the corner, one hand gripping her father's shoulder, her eyes tracking every movement. Sterling's voice was clipped, professional, speaking to his residents in the rapid-fire language of trauma, femurs obviously fractured, anterior and posterior displacement, soft tissue damage significant, let's get x-rays of the chest and abdomen before we take him to OR. Brooke moved into the room with the other nurses, not assigned yet but drawn by something she couldn't name. There was something about this case. Something about the way the colonel's chest was moving, too shallow, too labored, the breath sounds on the left side just barely there. A portable x-ray machine was wheeled in, and the technician positioned it while everyone stepped back. 30 seconds later, the image was on the monitor in the trauma bay. Brooke was standing near the back of the room when she saw it. The film showed the compound fracture clearly, that was obvious, the bone fragments bright white against the darker tissue. But there was something else. A thin line of dark space along the left chest wall. Pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax building, not yet critical but moving in that direction with every breath, every heartbeat. The pressure was building inside the colonel's chest cavity, compressing his heart, making every breath harder. If nobody caught it, if nobody decompressed it, he'd arrest within hours. She was certain of it. Her hands knew before her mind had finished thinking. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Sterling was already snapping orders, already confident in his diagnosis and his plan. The other nurses weren't looking at the x-ray the way she was looking at it. The residents were writing notes, waiting for orders. The attending surgeon had just arrived and was reviewing the films with Sterling, nodding, already planning the surgical approach. Brooke stepped back. Kept her head down. The rule was simple, invisible nurses didn't speak up. Invisible nurses didn't challenge attending physicians in their own trauma bays. Invisible nurses survived by not making waves. The colonel was being prepped for surgery. The daughter was being escorted out by a social worker, her face crumpling now that she wasn't being watched. Brooke pulled off her gloves and moved to the next task. At 11:45 a.m., during routine ER coverage, a patient came in with severe lacerations to the forearm, a work injury, broken glass, the artery nicked but not severed. The trauma surgeon was upstairs with the colonel. The ER doctor was young and nervous, already calling for blood, already reaching for clamps. Brooke was there to run supplies, to assist, to stay in the background. But her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory took over. She guided the surgeon's hand to apply pressure at exactly the right angle. Proximal first, she said quietly. The bleeding point. The surgeon listened, and the bleeding slowed. A visiting combat medic from the 101st Airborne was waiting in the bay for a shoulder wound to be dressed. He'd been traveling through San Diego, fallen off a ladder, nothing serious, just needed 6 stitches. He was watching Brooke's hands as she helped tie off the bleeders, watching the way she created a field of relative bloodlessness with nothing but pressure and angle and the kind of knowledge that came from a very specific kind of experience. When she turned to leave, he caught her eye for just long enough to whisper, "Where did you learn to tie off bleeders like that?" She didn't answer. Just nodded and walked away. The question was already burning in her chest like a scar reopening. The locker room was empty at 2:33 p.m. Brooke sat on the bench in front of her locker and opened the door. The boots looked back at her. 12 years she'd worn them. 12 years walking in something close to purpose, until Marja had taken that away, until the tremor had gotten so bad she couldn't hold a scalpel anymore. She'd told everyone she'd never left California. She'd told her family she was still stationed overseas, sent them fake emails every month for 2 years, each one a lie wrapped in military routine. She'd chosen this, invisibility, small moment of quiet competence, the luxury of not being known. The combat medic's question hung in the air above the boots like a ghost. She closed the locker without touching them. The shift was only halfway through. The colonel was still in surgery. The X-ray was still in his file, the pneumothorax still waiting for someone to notice it, waiting for someone to care enough to speak up. She walked back to the unit and found her next task. Invisible. Compliant. Exactly what Dr. Sterling expected. The colonel lay motionless on the hospital bed, machines cataloguing his decline, ventilator hissing, monitors beeping their steady arithmetic of survival. His daughter stood in the corner, arms crossed tight against her chest, eyes moving between her father's face and the doctors who circled him like wolves evaluating prey. Dr. Sterling bent over the patient's chest X-ray on the wall-mounted monitor, his finger tracing the fracture lines with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong in his life. Brooke moved closer, studying the image. Her eyes caught something Sterling's had already moved past, the compression pattern in the mediastinal space, the subtle widening that shouldn't be there. The rib fracture itself was routine. But the pneumothorax building beneath it wasn't. She'd seen this before. Not in textbooks. In reality. In the dust and blood of a field hospital where there were no second chances. Dr. Sterling, she said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. The rib fracture pattern suggests a secondary pneumothorax. The mediastinal shift on this image. He turned to face her with the speed of someone swatting an insect. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his words came out each one a hammer blow. Sullivan, when I need a medical opinion from someone with community college training, I'll request it explicitly. The daughter's eyes widened. Her hand went to her mouth. Sterling stepped closer to the monitor, deliberately turning his back to Brooke. When he spoke again, he raised his voice, not for clarity, but for audience. This requires surgical precision. Not your limited scope of practice. Stand back. Observe how it's actually done. Brooke took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened. She did not look away. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from shame, not from pain, but from the precise pressure of 1,000 nights holding this composure, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, a gesture so controlled it looked like she was removing dust. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. I've seen that injury before, doctor, she said quietly. You're missing the pneumothorax. Sterling's face went the color of old brick. Out. Now. You're off this patient's primary care team. That's an order. She left the room. The daughter watched her go, something shifting in the woman's face, confusion, recognition, the first crack in Sterling's authority that would grow much larger before this ended. Thursday afternoon, 12:19 p.m. Break room. The space smelled like burnt coffee and the plastic tang of leftover containers, someone's 3-day-old lunch defrosting in the corner of the refrigerator. Brooke sat at the center table, unwrapping her sandwich. The bread was slightly stale. She'd made it yesterday, before everything had started to collapse around her. Nurse Chen and Nurse Martinez were already seated at the far end of the table. They looked at each other when Brooke sat down. A single glance. That was all it took. They gathered their food, Chen's yogurt, Martinez's salad, stood up without speaking, and moved to the far table by the window. Nurse Jensen followed a moment later, her shoulders rounded apologetically but her feet moving anyway. Brooke unwrapped her sandwich. The kitchen went quiet except for the fluorescent light's electric hum and the refrigerator's compressor cycling. She could hear them whispering. Not loud enough to catch individual words, but their voices carried the weight of conspiracy. Someone laughed quietly. The sound stopped when Sterling appeared in the break room doorway, surveyed the room, saw Brooke sitting alone, and smiled. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Friday morning, the unit board. A white sheet of paper posted at exactly eye level where all staff gathered, physicians, nurses, phlebotomists, dietary, everyone who worked this floor. The header printed in bold, written warning. Below it, in Sterling's precise handwriting, Nurse B. Sullivan. Overstepping scope of practice. Questioning physician judgment. Unauthorized diagnostic suggestions. Failure to maintain professional hierarchy. Sterling stood beside the board, waiting. He timed it to catch the shift change. 10 staff members approached, read the notice, glanced at Brooke as she arrived for her shift, then looked away. The weight of institutional authority made visible. Made official. Made permanent. Sterling's voice carried across the unit. Let this be a reminder to everyone about the hierarchy we maintain here. Nursing staff provide care under physician direction. Not independent assessment. Not opinions. Care. He paused, letting that sink in. I won't tolerate insubordination. Not from anyone. Brooke reached the board. She read every word. Her hands trembled, just slightly, a small vibration like a hummingbird's wings. One breath. Then her eyes found Sterling's across the room. Is that all, Doctor? Her voice was barely above a whisper but perfectly steady. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. That afternoon in the ER, a visiting combat medic from the 101st Airborne stood in the observation area, watching routine procedures. He had the bearing of someone who'd made peace with violence, shoulders loose, eyes sharp, the way someone moves after they've seen what humans can do to each other. A laceration repair on a patient's forearm. Arterial bleeder. Superficial but annoying. One of those cases where technique mattered more than urgency. Brooke was assigned to assist. She worked with a kind of economical grace, her movements precise as a metronome. When the bleeding wouldn't stop with direct pressure, she took the needle from the surgical tray, and her hands moved through 3 specific loops, a technique that wasn't common, that most nurses learned only in the military, that took years of field experience to execute without conscious thought. Her muscle memory taking over. The medic froze mid-suture on his own patient. He stared at her hands. Then at her face. Then back at her hands. When the procedure finished and Brooke turned to leave, he stepped into her path. His voice dropped low, barely audible in the chaos of the ER. Where did you learn to tie off bleeders like that? Brooke's face went pale. Her hand stilled. When she spoke, her voice had changed, not in volume, but in texture. Nursing school. The medic shook his head slowly. His eyes held something between recognition and accusation. No. You didn't. Saturday morning passed in a fog of routine. Brooke moved through her shift like a ghost, checking vitals, updating charts, performing all the small rituals of nursing care while Sterling had specifically reassigned her away from the colonel's room. But she could see him from the hallway. Still unconscious. Still critical. Still missing something Sterling couldn't identify. The respiratory pattern was wrong. The oxygen saturation was drifting downward in subtle increments. The kind of deterioration that wouldn't trigger alarms for another 6 to 8 hours. By then it would be too late. That evening, she sat in her car in the apartment complex parking lot, staring at her hands against the steering wheel. They were shaking. Not from fear. From exhaustion. From the weight of 2 years of lying to her family, of sending fake emails about overseas deployments that never happened, of pretending she was still the person she used to be instead of someone so broken she'd chosen to disappear. Sunday morning, the VA hospital waiting room. Grey chairs bolted to grey linoleum. A television in the corner playing news no one was watching. Around her sat the people she used to save. A Marine with a prosthetic left leg, the amputation clean but the man's eyes far away. An army sergeant with burn scars that covered the right side of his neck and disappeared beneath his collar. A Navy veteran in a wheelchair, and wrapped in gauze, his shoulders hunched like he was still carrying weight that nobody else could see. Brooke filled out the intake form. Name. Date of birth. Previous military service. She checked yes. Rank. She left that blank. She couldn't write it. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The words felt like a lie now, a uniform she'd shed the day she walked away from Marja because the PTSD made her shake so badly she couldn't hold a scalpel. Couldn't hold a life. Couldn't hold anything except the knowledge that if she didn't disappear, she'd break everyone around her. Previous medical issues. PTSD. Insomnia. Occupational trauma. She'd been sending emails to her mother every month for 2 years. Made-up stories about her deployment to Kandahar, fake photographs of bases she'd found on military websites, careful lies constructed from the wreckage of who she'd been. Her family still thought she was serving. Still thought she was out there saving lives instead of sitting in a civilian hospital pretending to be someone who'd never been to war. A nurse called her name. She stood up. Her legs felt uncertain, as if she'd been sitting for longer than 2 hours. As if she'd been sitting for 2 years. Monday morning, she returned to Sacred Heart. The colonel was still unconscious. His daughter hadn't left his side in 3 days. Brooke could see them from the nurse's station, the woman's hand on her father's arm, the machines keeping him alive with their relentless mathematics. The respiratory rate was climbing. The oxygen saturation was dropping. The subtle signature of a tension pneumothorax building like a storm system nobody had recognized. She started toward the room. Sterling intercepted her in the corridor, his body blocking her path with the casual authority of someone who controlled everything in this space. "You're not assigned to this patient anymore, Sullivan. I've made that very clear." Brooke looked at him. Just looked. No argument. No defense. No tears. Just a nurse who knew something was wrong and a doctor who was too proud to listen, and somewhere behind them, a patient running out of time. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of California sunlight that made everything look clean and simple. Dr. Sterling rounded on the colonel at 9:51 a.m., his golf shoes still damp from the course, his mind already 3 holes ahead. He examined the chest X-ray again, the same image that had hung there for 18 hours, and nodded with the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about anything that mattered. "Stable," Sterling announced to the assembled residents. "Compound fracture is healing. Internal bleeding controlled. Reduce monitoring to standard vitals every 4 hours. Here's a routine case now." The words carried the weight of someone closing a file, moving on, already calculating how much time he could bill for today's work. Brooke was in the medication room when she heard the news trickle down through the nursing staff. 4-hour monitoring intervals. Minimal coverage assigned. Sterling had pulled the ICU-level protocols and reassigned her to the pediatric wing, a move so transparent it was almost honest. She stood alone between the medication dispensers, her hand steady while her jaw tightened. The colonel's oxygen saturation had been riding between 93 and 95 all night. The jugular vein distension was still visible in his neck. The breath sounds on the right side of his chest were diminished but not absent. All the classic hallmarks of something building, pressure accumulating, a ticking clock disguised as a stable patient. At 10:15 a.m., Sterling sat in his office on the 3rd floor and made the first phone call. "Murray. Sterling. We need to talk about one of our staff members." His voice carried the casual authority of a man calling in favors, not asking for help. Murray Goldstein played golf with Sterling every Saturday morning for the past 11 years. They had business together, a real estate venture in Mission Valley that paid both of them 6 figures annually, completely legal, completely leveraged. "There's a nurse here, Brooke Sullivan. She's been practicing outside her scope. I need you to call the board, request an audit. I'll handle the documentation." The call took 4 minutes. Sterling hung up and waited exactly 7 minutes before dialing the second number. Richard Hayes, the hospital's vice chairman, who owed Sterling a quiet favor from 2019 when Sterling had stayed late one night and didn't report what he'd seen in the emergency department, a problem that had quietly disappeared. Hayes answered on the second ring. "I'm concerned about patient safety," Sterling said, and those 5 words opened every door. "I need the credentialing office to pull the file on our problematic nurse. Full background. Education records. References. Everything. I'll escalate to the state board if necessary." It wasn't a threat. It was the sound of a man reaching for his institutional levers, and in hospitals, those levers moved mountains. By noon, Sterling had also called Sacred Heart's credentialing office and demanded that Brooks Nursing School references be contacted immediately. "Full files," he'd said. "Anything concerning? I want answers by Monday." The office manager knew his tone. It meant compliance, not conversation. The calls went out that afternoon to San Diego State's nursing program, to her preceptor from 2015, to the 3 instructors who had trained her in basic medical surgical nursing. All of them received the same message: "We are conducting a credentialing audit. We need your full assessment of Brooke Sullivan's competency. This is time-sensitive." By Monday morning, an investigator from the California Board of Registered Nursing had been contacted by someone, Sterling didn't need to know who, and had begun the formal process of arriving at Sacred Heart to review Brooke's personnel file, her procedures, her charting, her patient outcomes. The state moved slowly, but it moved. Once the machinery started, only evidence could stop it. At 2:33 p.m. that same Monday, Sterling walked through the pediatric wing where Brooke was restocking supply carts, deliberately stocking them with extra saline and gauze, the kind of work that kept her visible and compliant. He didn't look at her directly. He just spoke to the charge nurse within her earshot. "Sullivan will be assigned to pediatrics this week. I need fresh perspective on her judgment before we proceed with the investigation." The investigation. Not an investigation. The investigation. As if it had already begun, already found something, already determined an outcome. Brooke didn't respond. Didn't flinch. Just kept counting saline bottles, 42, 43, 44. Her hands moved like a machine, but her mind was 3 floors down in the ICU, in the colonel's room, watching a patient deteriorate under the care of a doctor who had staked his entire career on the idea that he'd never missed anything and never would. The pediatric assignment was strategic genius, really. It removed her from the ICU entirely. It meant she couldn't check on the colonel without violating protocols. It meant she was visible, contained, monitored. It meant she was being punished in slow motion, the way institutions punished people who knew too much and had nowhere to prove it. At 10:04 p.m. that same Monday, the intercom crackled with the sound that every medical professional dreads. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. ICU patient. Then a pause. Then a second call. Code Blue, ICU, Bed 7. Colonel James Hartwell, Bed 7. Brooke froze. The saline bottle hung in her hand like it had turned to lead. Bed 7. She'd memorized the room number. She'd walked past it 43 times in 4 days, counting. The colonel. Her patient. The one who'd been stable, routine, nothing to worry about. Her feet moved before her brain could argue with her. The pediatric wing dissolved behind her as she ran toward the ICU, her badge swinging like a pendulum, her shoes squeaking against tile the way shoes squeak when they're moving at something just short of a sprint. Through the ICU glass doors, she could see them already, Sterling barking orders like he owned the room, 2 residents moving too slow, a nurse pushing epinephrine into the fall line. The colonel's daughter was being guided into the hallway by a patient advocate, her face split open with the kind of terror that only hospitals create. Brooke caught one glimpse of the monitor before a security guard stepped in front of her like a wall. "Dr. Sterling says you're not authorized in this unit tonight, Sullivan." She didn't argue. Didn't push. Just stopped, positioned herself at an angle where she could see through the glass partition. And what she saw was murder in slow motion. The monitor showed what she already knew it would show: jugular vein distension making the colonel's neck swell, tracheal deviation pulling his airway sideways, absent breath sounds on the entire right side of his chest. A tension pneumothorax, pressure building inside the chest cavity, collapsing the lung, pushing against the heart, squeezing the life out of him one compression at a time. Sterling was giving epinephrine, doing chest compressions, bagging oxygen. All correct procedures for cardiac arrest. All absolutely useless for what was actually killing the patient. It was like trying to fix a tire by adding more air while the car was driving into the ocean. Sterling looked up from the compressions and saw her watching through the glass. Their eyes met for 1 second. Then he turned and deliberately pulled the curtain closed, a gesture so deliberate it was a confession. 42 minutes. That's how long the code ran. Brooke sat on a bench outside the ICU, her hands folded in her lap, not shaking because shaking would require acknowledgement of what she was watching. At 10:48 p.m., Sterling emerged from the ICU bay, stripped his gloves, and spoke to the assembled team. Time of death, 10:46 p.m. We did everything right. This one just wasn't meant to be. He said it the way you'd close a book you'd already read. Then he walked past Brooke without looking at her, down the hallway toward the elevator that would take him home, to his bourbon, to his wife who didn't ask questions, to his bed where he would sleep without seeing the face of the man he'd just let die out of pride. The colonel's daughter made a sound that wasn't human. It was the sound of a man's entire existence being erased in a single moment, and Brooke had to turn her face away because looking would crack the restraint that was all she had left. At 1:57 a.m. on Tuesday morning, the charge nurse appeared in the supply room where Brooke was organizing full lines in the dark. Sullivan. Sterling went home. The colonel just crashed again. He's still alive, barely. You're the only ICU-trained nurse on the floor right now. The nurse didn't ask. Didn't explain. Just stated the facts and waited for Brooke to understand what came next. He was still alive. 42 minutes after being called dead, after being told there was nothing left to do, after being transported to the morgue prep room, the colonel's body had moved. His heart had beaten. He was gasping for air that couldn't reach his lungs because the pressure in his chest cavity was still there, still building, still about to kill him the same way Sterling had almost let it kill him the first time. Brooke stood. The 4 lines fell to the floor. She had a choice: follow Sterling's orders, follow the hospital hierarchy, follow the rules that were being written by a man too proud to admit he'd missed a diagnosis. Or she could walk through those ICU doors and do what she'd been trained to do by the United States Navy in a field hospital in Helmand Province where the only rule that mattered was keeping people alive. She was moving before she finished thinking. The monitors screamed. All 3 of them at once, a symphony of failure that cut through the quiet ICU like shrapnel through canvas. Brooke's hands were moving before her brain caught up, muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than her quiet life in San Diego. The pediatric wing dissolved behind her. The stairwell was 3 flights. She took them 2 at a time. The colonel's room was chaos, wearing a hospital gown. His daughter stood frozen in the corner, one hand pressed against her mouth. The ventilator hissed like something dying. On the monitor, oxygen saturation at 76% and dropping, heart rate 147, blood pressure collapsing like a failed structure. The colonel's chest rose and fell in that terrible paradoxical rhythm, the one that meant the lungs were filling with it that had nowhere to go. Tension pneumothorax. The exact injury she'd warned Sterling about 3 days ago. The exact injury he'd dismissed. Brooke moved to the bedside without hesitation. No gloves. No asking permission. The code blue team was supposed to be here. They weren't. She had 3 minutes, maybe 4, before his brain started dying from oxygen starvation. His neck veins were distended so badly they looked ready to burst. No breath sounds on the right side. She pressed the stethoscope to his chest and heard nothing but the machine's hollow lies. The monitor showed a heart that was beating but a body that was drowning in its own air pocket. "What are you doing?" The daughter's voice cracked like breaking glass. Brooke didn't answer. She reached for the crash cart, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd made these decisions under actual fire. The 14-gauge needle was where it always was. She tore open the alcohol prep, ran it across the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was the same on everyone. The physics of pneumothorax didn't care about rank or protocol. Air under pressure had to go somewhere, and right now it was compressing the colonel's right lung into a useless wedge. Her hands trembled violently as she positioned the needle. One breath. That's what she allowed herself. Eyes closed. The sound of the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in the darkness behind her eyelids. 7 months. Marja. A bunker that collapsed on its own during an assault. 14 Marines bleeding into sandbags. No attending surgeon. Just her hands and decisions made in real time with no safety net and no second chances. She opened her eyes. Steady. The needle went in. Through skin. Through muscle. Through the pleura. And then, the hiss of air escaping, a sound like relief, like a pressure valve opening in a submarine. The colonel's entire body relaxed. His back arched down from the mattress. The sound was the most beautiful thing she'd heard in 6 months. The monitor shifted. Oxygen saturation 82%. Climbing. 87. 91. The heart rate drifted down. The daughter made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Brooke stayed where she was, hands still raised, the needle secured with tape, waiting for her hands to remember they were part of a civilian hospital and not a field surgery in a collapsed bunker. The colonel's breathing stabilized. His color returned from the gray-white of dying men to something that resembled a living person. Brooke moved to the forestand, checking drip rates, adjusting the oxygen flow, watching for reaccumulation. The monitor beeped its normal rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Blood pressure stabilizing. She stayed in that room for 4 hours straight, watching, waiting, adjusting medications with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between saving a life and losing one was often measured in milliliters and minutes. By 6:30 in the morning, the sun had started its assault on the parking lot. Brooke was still in the colonel's room, a coffee cup she'd stolen from the break room sitting cold on the bedside table. The colonel was breathing on his own now. His oxygen saturation hadn't dropped below 94% in the last 2 hours. His daughter had fallen asleep in the visitor's chair around 4 a.m., her head tilted at an angle that would destroy her neck, but she was alive, and so was her father, and nothing else mattered. Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 6:45 like clockwork. Brooke heard his footsteps before she saw him, shoes that cost more than her car, leather that whispered of country clubs and inherited confidence. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved from the colonel, now peaceful and stable, to the needle decompression kit on the bedside table, to Brooke standing at the monitor with the flat expression of someone who'd been awake for hours and was past the point of exhaustion. His face went white first. Then red. Not the red of embarrassment. The red of someone watching control slip away like water through open fingers. "What have you done?" His voice was low and dangerous. Brooke didn't turn around. "My job." "You performed a procedure you are not licensed to perform. You performed a medical intervention that is explicitly outside your scope of practice. You directly violated my orders." His hands were shaking. "This is over. Do you understand me? This is finished." He pulled his phone out before she finished nodding. She watched him dial. Watched him walk into the hallway. Watched him make the first of what would be many calls, 2 board members from his golf club, a state investigator he apparently kept on speed dial, the hospital administrator. His voice through the thin hospital walls was controlled now, measured, the voice of someone with institutional power behind him and the will to use it. She performed an unauthorized procedure. A needle decompression without physician oversight. Scope of practice violation, insubordination, potential harm to the patient. I want her credentialed investigated by end of business. I want security prepared to escort her out by noon. Brooke stayed in the room with the colonel. She didn't cry. The trembling that had steadied her hands during the procedure came back now, a fine tremor that ran through her entire body like a tuning fork. But her face remained blank. Her breathing remained even. She'd been trained to function on empty, to keep moving when everything inside was breaking. A Navy hospital in a war zone didn't have the luxury of falling apart. The wounded didn't care if your hands were shaking. They cared if the bleeding stopped. By 9 in the morning, she was in the administrator's office. Sterling was there with hospital legal counsel, a woman in an expensive suit who looked like she'd been summoned to clean up messes like this before. The words came in waves: practicing medicine without a license, performing procedures outside her scope, insubordination, patient endangerment. Sterling's version of events was clinical, precise, designed to make her sound like a rogue employee who'd acted against his direct orders. He didn't mention the tension pneumothorax he'd missed. He didn't mention the colonel's oxygen saturation had been 76%. You're placed on immediate suspension pending investigation by the state licensing board, the administrator said. His voice was already resigned. He decided before she walked in. Security will escort you from the building. You may not contact patients. You may not return to Sacred Heart unless and until the board clears you. Brooke stood up. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't defend herself. She walked out of the office, down 3 flights of stairs, through the staff hallway to her locker. The other nurses watched. Some had the grace to look away. Others stared. She opened the locker and began placing items into a cardboard box that security had provided. Her spare stethoscope. Her surgical shears. The pen she'd stolen from the break room. A paperback novel she'd been reading for 6 months and never quite finished. The worn combat boots were at the bottom, pushed into the corner where she kept them away from eyes. Brown leather scarred from sand and heat. Laces still tied from the last time she'd worn them, 7 years ago in Helmand Province. She held them for a moment, just long enough for her hands to stop shaking, then placed them on top of the box. She didn't look back as she walked to the exit. The security guard was the same one who'd blocked her from the ICU 2 days ago during the code. He stood by the exit with the expression of someone following orders he didn't fully understand. He was young. 23, maybe. He'd probably never worked with a trauma surgeon before. Probably thought all nurses were the same, interchangeable, replaceable, limited. He handed her the box without meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Brooke took the box and walked into the San Diego heat. Behind her, the hospital's glass doors reflected the morning sun like a mirror. She could see her own outline in that reflection, a nurse in green scrubs carrying a cardboard box containing the evidence that she'd tried to build a normal life. Above the entrance, the hospital's logo caught the light, a cross and a sword, symbolizing healing and conflict. She wondered which one she was now. The parking lot was empty except for the morning shift's cars. Her truck was 10 years old, paid for, and waiting. She placed the box in the passenger seat and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands were shaking again. The tremor ran through her entire body like an electric current. She had no job. She had a suspension letter. She had a state investigation opening that would take months to resolve. She had the combat boots and a personnel file that would answer questions she'd never wanted asked. And somewhere in this hospital, an Air Force colonel was breathing because she'd made a decision that had been the right one and would destroy her anyway. The next voice she heard wasn't human. It was a radio crackle, military band frequency, coming from the emergency entrance. A Black Hawk helicopter was landing on the hospital's pad. That was unusual. Sacred Heart did civilian trauma. The military came to naval base hospitals. But that particular bird belonged to Naval Base San Diego, and the timing made her pause, fingers on the ignition. Something was about to change. Wednesday morning came with the machine sounds of recovery, the ventilator's mechanical rhythm steady, the cardiac monitors beep 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 like a metronome counting someone back to life. The colonel's eyes opened at 6:22 a.m., and for 3 full seconds he stared at the ceiling without seeing anything. Then awareness crept in, slow and confused. His daughter wasn't there yet. The room was quiet except for the hiss of oxygen and the distant rattle of a supply cart down the hallway. A nurse approached his bed, checking the fall line with practiced efficiency. Not Brooke. The colonel's voice came out like gravel under wheels. The nurse. The one who was here when I... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't remember the code. Didn't remember the crash. But something in his body knew she'd been there. I need to thank her. The nurse hesitated. Checked her tablet. Senior Chief Sullivan. There's been some complications with her assignment. Let me find out if she's available. The colonel's jaw tightened. That title, Senior Chief, meant something. Meant rank. Meant authority. Meant this wasn't just a nurse asking permission to help. This was someone who'd spent her life earning that designation. By 8:15 a.m., Brooke hadn't arrived. The hospital administrator had called her the night before, informal, careful. We need to talk about your suspension being premature. That's all. She was still processing that single sentence when her phone buzzed with a text, "Come in. There's something you need to see." She drove through San Diego in morning traffic, hand steady on the wheel, the combat boots still in her duffel on the passenger seat. She'd started to unpack them. Had taken them out of the box. But stopped short of putting them on, of claiming that part of herself in public. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening. The ER doors slid open at 8:43 a.m., and that's when everything accelerated. A security detail arrived with a prisoner, handcuffed, in a military transport wheelchair, the kind reserved for high-value detainees or those with critical medical needs. The man was Afghan, maybe late 30s, with a scar that split his left eyebrow and eyes that held the color of burnt stone. He was bleeding from a wound that needed immediate surgical evaluation. 2 Marine guards stood at attention as they wheeled him into Trauma Bay 3. Brooke was walking past the observation window when the prisoner's head turned. His eyes found her face. Locked on it. Everything in his body went rigid. The translator came running behind the wheelchair. The prisoner spoke in rapid Dari, words tumbling over each other. The translator, a young army specialist, listened and then said very carefully, "He wants to know if he's asking if you're the American doctor from Marja. He says you saved his brother when no one else would touch him." The room didn't go quiet. The room couldn't go quiet, there was too much equipment running, too much crisis momentum. But Brooke felt the conversation stop around her like ripples spreading outward. The trauma team slowed their preparations by half a second. One of the physicians looked up from the chart. Brooke stood motionless. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was level. That was a long time ago. He says his brother was Taliban. The translator's voice was careful, neutral. But the doctor at the aid station was dying from shrapnel wounds, and no one would help him because he was Taliban. You did. Even though you knew what he was. The prisoner said something else in Dari, longer this time. His voice carried something that transcended language, gratitude mixed with something harder to name. Recognition, maybe. Or debt. The translator said, "He says he was Taliban then. He's not now. He wants you to know he's not now." A sound came from behind Brooke, shoes on tile, quick and deliberate. The colonel's daughter had gotten out of bed, still in a hospital gown, still connected to a rolling for stand. Her face was pale, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent the last 24 hours understanding exactly what had happened in her father's room. She stepped forward and looked directly at Brooke. "My father is a colonel," she said, her voice shaking. "But what rank are you?" Everything moved slower after that. The prisoner was wheeled to the surgical suite. The translator was asked to follow. The trauma team dispersed into their roles, and the hallway that had held a secret for 36 hours suddenly became public territory. Brooke walked to her locker without a word. Her hands moved on their own, spinning the combination dial, pulling open the metal door. The worn combat boots were there, on top of her other things. And underneath them, at the very bottom, was the manila envelope. Her personnel file. She'd never opened it fully. Hadn't wanted to look at the parts of herself she'd left behind. She pulled it out. The papers were yellowed, official. She stood in front of her open locker and let the envelope open in her hands like a book. The pages fell out and scattered. The administrator was there suddenly, Dr. Mendez, who'd been the one to call her about the suspension being premature. Next to him stood a man in digital camouflage with the bearing of someone who didn't need to introduce himself. Naval Base Command. 2 steps behind them was another figure, a SEAL team leader, hard-angled face, eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The SEAL team leader bent and picked up one of the scattered pages. Then another. He read them the way someone reads a timeline of violence and sacrifice. His voice came out like a tank idling in a garage, low, constant, impossible to ignore. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, Navy Cross, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, Purple Heart, she ran a field hospital under fire for 7 months. He paused. Let that sit in the hallway like a weight. She saved 347 service members during that deployment. 46 of them would have died without her. Another pause. She performed emergency surgery in a tent while rounds came through the canvas. She taught corpsmen how to save lives when they had nothing but gauze and prayer. And she did it while bleeding from her own wounds. He looked at the pages in his hand, then back at Brooke. She also saved an Taliban fighter's brother. Even though she knew what he was. Dr. Sterling had emerged from his office sometime in the last minute. Brooke hadn't heard him. But she could feel his presence now, the air pressure changing, his mouth opening to speak, to defend, to argue. His hands were shaking. Visible tremors that no amount of authority could hide. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again. Nothing came out but air. The hospital administrator stepped forward. Dr. Sterling, your suspension is now permanent pending investigation. You don't understand, Sterling's voice cracked across the syllables. She violated protocol. She performed procedures without authorization. I have 20 years at this institution. You have credentials that don't match your CV, the Admiral said flatly. You missed a tension pneumothorax on an X-ray that a suspended nurse identified in 60 seconds. You prevented her from providing emergency care to a critical patient. And you filed false complaints to cover your error. I need to call my attorney. You need to call your union rep, the administrator said. He turned to the security guard standing nearby, the same guard who'd handed Brooke her belongings box the morning of her firing. Escort Dr. Sterling to his office. Give him 1 hour to collect his personal items. The guard moved forward. Sterling backed up, his posture crumbling in real time, like someone was dimming the lights on his authority with each passing second. The guard didn't touch him. Didn't need to. The inevitability was enough. They walked down the hallway together, Sterling and the guard placed an identical box on Sterling's desk, empty, waiting to be filled with the wreckage of someone's career. The guard said flatly, I believe you know the way out. The investigation that followed took 3 days. The State Licensing Board investigator reviewed the colonel's chart line by line. He examined the needle decompression procedure, 14-gauge catheter at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, executed with textbook precision. His conclusion came in front of witnesses in the hospital administrator's office. The procedure was medically appropriate. Properly executed. Life-saving. This nurse's training exceeds standard nursing practice. He turned to Dr. Sterling's empty chair. Any attempt to restrict a qualified provider from emergency care constitutes patient endangerment. By Friday, the investigation concluded that Sterling had falsified portions of the colonel's chart to hide his misdiagnosis. Had filed false complaints against 3 other nurses over 2 years. His credentials showed discrepancies, fellowship training he'd never completed. His medical license was suspended. Criminal charges for fraud were recommended. By Monday, Brooke heard from Nurse Jensen in the break room. Sterling was teaching CPR at San Diego Community College for minimum wage while under investigation. Teaching CPR to people who'd never been to Marja. Never had to choose between saving a life and following orders. That evening, Thursday, Brooke stood in the colonel's room. The worn combat boots were unpacked now, sitting beside her purse on the small chair in the corner. Not hidden anymore. Not ashamed. Just there. The colonel was sitting up, color returned, breath coming on his own. His daughter stood beside the bed, and when she saw Brooke, she moved forward and hugged her without asking for permission. "They told me everything," the colonel said. His voice was stronger now, the gravel still there but beneath it a core of steel. "You stayed for hours." "It's what anyone would have done, sir." "No." His eyes held hers. "It's what you did when everyone else walked away." He attempted to salute from his hospital bed, for line still running into his left arm, the gesture imperfect and powerful at the same time. Brooke hesitated for one breath. Then lifted her hand to her forehead in the mirror of his salute. The first salute she'd returned in 2 years. The first time she'd let herself be what she'd always been. The movement was controlled. Precise. The movement of someone reclaiming her own name. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And in that moment, with the evening light through the window and the monitor still beeping its steady rhythm, the lights had finally come on. Subscribe and follow for more stories of the ones we underestimate, the ones who save us when we don't even know we need saving.